again, everybody. Welcome back to the Retro Monster Truck Review. A couple weeks hiatus here. Unfortunately, had another loss in the family. We lost my grandmother, 80 years old, Alice Mercer. She's finally been put to rest, and we can get back to doing fun things like this. And with me on the show this week, Matt Stoltz. Matt, we are talking Penda, Lima, Ohio, 1995. And man, let me tell you, this weekend, up to this point in monster truck racing on a 250-foot track, is probably the fastest weekend in monster trucks.
Yeah, it's great to be back, Josh. We're pinch hitting this week, and want to say, certain salutations to you and your family, and we've got you all in our thoughts and prayers with the losses that you guys have had, and we hope that you guys are able to get through that without any issue. And now back into Penda racing. This is some of the fastest racing we've ever seen, and it's a heck of a weekend of competition.
Oh, yeah, it's one heck of a weekend of competition, as you just said. And to bring us this weekend of competition, we've got one of the classic announcing duos, Gary Lee and Army Armstrong.
They're back again. Seems like you and I talk about these guys a lot, and they're one of the best duos in the history of the industry for monster truck racing, and they just do a fantastic job every single time.
In pro wrestling, you had, in the early days, you had Gorilla Monsoon and you had Bobby Heenan. And to me, this is your Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan of monster truck racing. This combination, they are both excellent at what they do, and neither one of them really throw out anything that's overly silly or goofy to compare the commentary to. They keep everything as serious as they can to an extent, and they know when to throw in a joke or two.
Yeah, and they managed to play each other's straight man very well. It's an interesting dynamic. Usually you've got one guy doing one job, one the other. They kind of flip roles. I mean, within each episode, multiple times. It just works.
Yeah, very true. This weekend, like we said, one of the fastest weekends in monster truck racing, and they actually start off the show with Gary Lee saying, "Hey, this is the AB era," which means after Brass. Bigfoot and Andy Brass had parted ways at the end of the 1994 season, and this event marks the second 1995 Penda event that we would not see Andy Brass behind the wheel of Bigfoot. His replacement is Eric Meager, and man, Eric Meager is a name that doesn't get enough recognition in monster truck racing as far as I'm concerned. He had to step into probably the most high-profile ride in the sport at that time.
Oh, the pressure's on. You're going into the marquee name, Bigfoot. You're driving their newest truck, Bigfoot 15, jumping right into the seat. And Eric had been driving for a few years. He started driving in 90, 91, somewhere in that range. Drove the snakebite truck on Bigfoot 4 chassis for a couple years. Hopped into Bigfoot 10 for the 1994 point series. He was Colt Cobra that year. And then his first real big ride on television every week is in that big blue Ford. New graphics, new look, new truck, and a new driver for 1995.
Yeah, and the new graphics on the side of Bigfoot are astonishing. They are just some of the most iconic graphics that they've ever done on the truck. And it's no stranger, Bigfoot's always had great paint schemes. But this one just seemed like the latest in a lineage of awesome paint schemes. You start out with the regular blue with the name on the side and the little truck. Cascade that onto the racer stripe, which is probably the most iconic scheme for Bigfoot. Then Wildfoot, out of nowhere, this paint scheme comes along, and you're like, wow, this is just totally out of left field. And then here comes this pink and teal is what they call it. And it's just one of the coolest paint schemes. It looks like a giant lightning bolt on the side of the truck. And it's one of the more sought after ones for some of the people out there in the RC world.
Yeah, they ran kind of a hybrid scheme in 94 on Andy's truck with the original Bigfoot Cruiser, as they called it, for the race truck, kind of taking the stripe scheme and morphing it into this pink and teal that we would see in the following year. I'm not sure if that was the Grand Master plan to have this scheme the next year, and that was the transition year, but boy, that truck looked cool. I think this truck looks even better. This is a truck from my childhood that I remember watching every Sunday on TNN, live every week on Sunday morning. The events weren't live. I was watching it live as it was on TV. But, the TNN Motor Madness shows, this is the scheme that was on TV at that time. And they had a lot of success during this period as well.
Yeah, they certainly did. And here with this 1995 paint scheme, we should say this is on the actual square-bodied Bigfoot truck. This is a rare scheme to an extent because you didn't see this very long on this truck. It was this season only that this ran, and then in 1996 we saw a complete flip flop with the new Ford F. What was it, 250 or 150 that they threw on Dan Runte's truck, and man, from that point on, Dan was the man in Bigfoot.
Yeah, they went back to the new F-150 for 1996, and this was the last year for what they actually called the Aero Nose.
Hmm.
At the time, it was more aerodynamic than the brick nose before it, but the Aero Nose pickup from late 91 for the 92 model year all the way through 95, and then a new F series for 96 comes out, and that's what we see for the next couple years in the Bigfoot team all the way through, I think, 2001, 2002. They're still running that body. So definitely an iconic scheme, but like you said, only running it 1 year, so it wasn't around too long.
It wasn't around too long, but man, is it cool to look at. Like I said, it's one of the ones that people sought after in the RC world. Just to give a little backstory, though, on this season in Penda, they held the first event inside the RCA Dome in Indianapolis, which is interesting because it actually happened 7 months before they run this event in Lima, Ohio. So I guess you could say Gary Porter has been the guy that led the points the longest in Penda up to this point. A 7 month reign on top of the Penda points until we actually get here to Lima. And just to give a little context back on Bigfoot, in the Indy show, Bigfoot doesn't make it past round one, really. Fastest qualifier was Eric Meager and Bigfoot, and they immediately went out after round number one. Teammate Lonnie Childress was subbing for Dan Runte in the Power Wheels truck, and Lonnie breaks on the line in qualifying. They don't even get to have a run for Power Wheels in Indy.
Yeah, Lonnie driving Bigfoot 10 at the time, I believe, with the Power Wheel scheme on it. Having some bad luck there in the RCA Dome. Unfortunately, didn't even get that much TV time because, again, both trucks out by the time they get to the TV round.
Yeah, and they misspelled his name, too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, Porter leading the points, I guess, for 7 months. Something a lot of people don't realize is this Penda Point Series is really consisted of only usually 5 weekends every year. That's the Spring Nationals normally, which would be in Lima. That was in June this year. Then you have the Summer Nationals in Bloomsburg in July, the Springfield Monster Drags in July, the Canfield Monster Drags in July or August, and then Indy Jamboree is in September, and that's your points finals. So, 2, 3, 4, 5 races at each track, but really there's not a whole lot of chance to really have a bad weekend here, because if you have one bad weekend, it could ruin your whole season.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point here. Speaking of that, Bigfoot had a horrible opening weekend for the 95 season, and now they've got to wait 7 months before they can get another attack onto the track. However, that is a good time for them to do some R&D maybe. Speaking of a team that does a lot of R&D going into this second event in 1995, Fred Schaefer and Barefoot. This truck is probably the fastest truck in monster truck racing to this point.
Fred and the Dodge team really put some muscle behind their R&D program heading into the 95 season. You figure they've got the big Dodge backing. They're trying to go after the Ford team, and they've been whipped up now in 92, 93, and 94. Pretty much got swept by the Bigfoot team every year. They're coming out literally loaded for bear in 95.
The cool thing that I noticed about the Fred Schaefer team here is yes, they keep Barefoot around. Dodge Express actually opens the season in the RCA Dome, and then it's quickly renamed just a little bit later to the more popular name Rampage. Shout out to Tony Cece, who has that big fifth scale Raminator that he christened Rampage, by the way. Cool looking truck, Tony. But man, the Rampage name starts off right here at this event. And I got to tell you, it's just a cool name. I mean, fitting for the sponsorship as well. Rampage. I mean, Dodge and Ram go together like peas in a pod, really.
Yeah, and the Dodge Rampage name was actually something back from the 80s. It was actually the name of a coupe utility vehicle, kind of like a Chevy El Camino or a Ford Ranchero, except it was a compact unibody coupe utility back in the mid-80s, and they revived the name to put on the side of the monster truck. It certainly fits the bill, I think, on the monster truck a little bit more than the real car if you look at it on the internet. Coupe utility. The day after we're recording this, yesterday, Ford announced their new Ford Maverick. I'm on the waiting list. We're getting one. So maybe the small truck conversion's coming back for big time here.
Hey, you know what? The small truck conversion could work out really good for a guy named Bill Payne. Anyway,
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way to put monster truck tires on it already.
the Allen County Fairgrounds is actually a place that I've actually been to. Lima, Ohio. The event was 2007. It was a four-wheel and off-road jamboree. It was a weekend billed as Bigfoot versus Gravedigger, ironically, and neither truck ever lined up against one another, which bad for the billing right there. But I got to actually interview Army Armstrong at that event. And one of these days, I'll post that up as like an extra thing here for the Retro Monster Truck Review viewers. If you ever want to listen to me talk to Army Armstrong and fan out for about 10 minutes, there you go. But man, that weekend in 2007, the Hall brothers dominated. This weekend, they actually show up on day two. We'll get to that later. I just wanted to point out there really quick, though, this track, I've been there. I know how much space there is here. And man, this just it leads into the point here that this is going to be a fast weekend. There is a very long shutdown area here, and you're going to see guys like Fred Schaefer and Dan Runte and Eric Meager and Gary Porter just on it all the way down the track. Also going to throw in Ken Deppy's name there as well in Rampage. That's another truck that was always putting down awesome passes here at Lima.
You're certainly right. It's a huge field, a lot of space to work with. And if you go back to the 80s, TNT Motorsports actually goes to the Allen County Fairgrounds. The 1989 event was televised. Huge. What was it, a 3-long jump track that they had in the infield, and they still had tons of room to shut the trucks down. They were working right to left. As you would look at it from the TNN camera side, they had their hard camera set up on the stand side of the infield, but just a huge field. And Special Events had the regulation 250-foot track for these Penda Point Series events. They're all supposed to be even, but I think as we get into the discussion here a little bit later, we'll see that this track is built just a little bit different that really gives the drivers an advantage to go fast.
Yep, event one, day one lineup here. We've got Fred Schaefer in Barefoot, Power Wheels Bigfoot with Dan Rente, Bigfoot with Eric Meager, Overkill and Kirk Dabney, Carolina Crusher and Gary Porter, Rampage and Ken Deppy, Monster Patrol with Paul Schaefer, no relation to Fred, Predator and Alan Pizzo, Boogie Van with Pam Wouters, and of course Moving Violation with Brian Welch. Always did like that Moving Violation truck, by the way. It was just one that, and it's pointed out by Army several times in this episode, that if it had just a little bit more money backing it, it could be a contender.
Oh, for sure. Brian Welsh showing up to really go after the points in 1995. We see a huge improvement over his previous endeavors in the Penda Point series. They mentioned the Dairy Mart sponsorship on the side of the truck throughout the episode. And if you go back and listen to Brian Welsh's episode on the Conversations with Scott Douglas podcast, he gets into that Dairy Mart sponsorship a good bit. And basically, they more or less gave him a blank check to go racing. They wanted the exposure, and they wanted to have that truck perform well. And we can't forget, of course, the Executioner team, the Hall brothers, they're here as well. They don't get in the TV round on race number 1, but they're in the house also.
Yeah, I don't believe that they were fast enough to make the 12-truck field for round number 1. But one truck that certainly was fast enough to make the field was Overkill and Kirk Dabney. But man, one of the wildest wrecks in monster truck history happens to Overkill here. And man, just to describe it, the truck looks perfect. The pass looks perfect until the landing off of the second jump. Kirk lands and the right rear lower suspension arm breaks. And let's explain this really quick. This chassis actually had link-mounted shocks, which to my knowledge is the first in monster truck history to do so.
Yeah, you and I are both RC racers. A lot of our RC monster trucks run this kind of a setup where your shock mounts on your link instead of the axle. And it makes those 4-link bars even more critical in terms of the suspension geometry, because as we see here, as Kirk lands off the second set of cars, that right rear heim joint where it goes into the cradle lets loose, and you're now losing your shock geometry and your axle location, and the truck hikes up real bad because the rear end is getting squirrely underneath the truck, and the truck high sides, and he goes into just a horrendous barrel roll flip.
Yeah, I mean, the damage that Army Armstrong shows here when they pan across to show the roll cage makes you really wonder and why some guys still insist on sitting to the left in a monster truck. Just by looking at this crash right here shows you where Kurt was really held inside that truck in the center seat that he had. The left side of the truck was caved in right where his helmet would have been if he was sitting on that side of the truck. So kudos to them for making that a center seat truck. But like I said, one of the worst accidents that has probably ever happened in the sport. I would rank that very close up there with King Kong from Myrtle Beach.
Well, you got to think about the King Crunch crash in Charlotte too in terms
Yeah,
of a
King
yard
Crunch, that's
sale
another one.
moment. In terms of a yard sale moment, there's a lot of damage there. And this crash puts Kirk out for a while. He doesn't come back on the series until Springfield, so he misses the Summer Jamboree in Bloomsburg. They're still putting the truck together, I guess. You know, Marty Garza doing a great design for that truck. And I'm not exactly sure what the weight on it was. I'm sure they were probably still right around that 10,000-pound limit, but another truck short of maybe the Bigfoot team, because they always ran a little bit over on weight, another truck probably would have done even more damage, to the cage and so forth, and a crash that bad at that time. Now we're used to the crazy wild and stunts of Monster Jam, but those trucks weigh 13,000 pounds now from the amount of tubing they have in the cage to keep the
Hmm.
drivers safe. Racing crashes like this were still not an overly common thing. So kudos to Marty for designing the truck safe enough to keep Kirk out of trouble.
Yeah, very true here. And speaking of which, Kurt was okay after this. This accident, and I know several people have probably seen this, but there were a few early YouTube videos that had come out featuring the fatal motorsports accidents. And this one seemed to always get featured in those like highlight videos on there. I want to stress Kirk Dabney was okay following this, and there still has never been a death inside the vehicle of a death of a driver inside of a monster truck. Still one of the safest motorsports in America for the driver out there. This is not the only thing that happened in qualifying though. 4.91 set by Andy Brass was the record for a 250-foot track. Fred Schaefer breaks that at a 4.86, setting quick time at that moment. And man, Barefoot looks like it's on a rail this weekend.
Yeah, but we get further in qualifying. Dan Runte shows up in a Power Wheels Bigfoot and just squeaks out the lower ET over Fred with a 4.84. It's going to be an absolute dogfight the entire weekend. The track is fast. The guys are hooked up. They've had a lot of time to freshen the trucks up. The drive lines are nice and smooth and biting hard. There's a lot of competition fast racing here this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, 4.86 to a 4.84. Quick qualifier goes Team Bigfoot by 0.02 seconds. That is insane to think about on here. Actually, I want to jump back real quick over to the Overkill accident right there. Kirk was interviewed, and one thing I actually forgot to mention was the fact that 2 years prior to this, in 1993's Lima, Ohio event, he does a very similar rollover in Nightmare, his own truck.
Yeah, it's crazy. Kirk probably never wanted to go back to Lima again. You know, the Nightmare in '93, he's coming off of that long launch ramp that they had. They tried out it in the Spring Nationals that year. Instead of having a crush card jump, the truck bottoms out hard and it high sides in a very similar manner, but kind of goes more head over heels in this case
Yeah,
and does a
it's a
lot of
little bit
damage.
lighter of a rollover. It looks like more or less it just kind of it folds in. I think it's the left front tire that folds in and just kind of snaps a heim joint there, and the front tires kind of do whatever they want to as the truck kind of just falls over onto the side. But
Yeah, still a
man,
nasty rebound crash, and Kirk, made it back that night to try to qualify for the second night in '93. I think he broke another tie rod when he landed off the second jump and didn't make the show for day two, just with a completely open cage, no body. But Overkill certainly not making it back for show two here in Lima in '95.
yeah, there was no way that that truck was coming back. There are some horrible accidents here in this Penda era because of how fast that the trucks are going, and this one right here probably ranks right up there with the first or second worst in the Penda era. I'm always going to say the one Dan Patrick had was just head over heels the worst Penda accident there ever was. This one still kind of ranks up there though, as far as holy crap moments in Penda. We go into round number one though, and round one highlights. Army Armstrong says something that jumps right out at me. It says, as far as things go today, we started out last night with a slapping contest, and now it's turned into a full-blown street fight. And of course, Army is referring to the Dodge and Ford situation that is going on this weekend. It seems like more now than ever, Dodge is really trying to be a threat to that Ford Crown.
You've got the two corporately backed teams with Ford and Dodge, and Army mentions it a good bit through the 94 season that the Chevrolets need to step up. And at the end of the season, they start to. And by 95 here, we've got a lot of competitive Chevrolets on the track as well. You've got Gary Porter and Carolina Crusher, Paul Schaefer and the Monster Patrol. Brian Welsh is running the GMC brand, but, the GM backing on that side a little bit. They're getting after these Ford and Dodge guys, and even though they don't have the big factory support, they're staying competitive.
Yeah, and the Chevrolet teams are also trying to keep right up on their heels. They are just maybe one tier below them at this point. Carolina Crusher, obviously the number one Chevrolet truck in Penda at this point. And currently, like I said, longest reigning points leader in Penda is Carolina Crusher, as Gary Porter took home the win in that RCA Dome event that he held the points lead for 7 months, coming all the way here to Lima. And in round number one shows you exactly it shows you he is here to play as he takes down Paul Schaefer and Monster Patrol. First thing I really noticed here is that there's a lot of standing water on this track from qualifying to racing, and they did a very good job of prepping these lanes to get them raceable here.
Lima seemed to always have a threat of rain, it seemed, most years, especially later into the 2000s. I can remember some of the World of Trucks episodes that we have up on YouTube. There's just mud everywhere. And, the Lima track here, we see the first jump is very, very smooth. A lot of times the trucks would kind of have to climb up over the set of cars. There wouldn't be an even transition from the ramp to the cars. But here, it's a very, very smooth transition. Lets the guys get into no man's land quick, get the power down, and then on top of it, the second jump, not very steep either, keeps the trucks low and moving fast. That's part of the reason why we're getting these fast times here.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a low, slick racetrack. And I got to tell you, Gary Porter does a simple A to B pass right here. He moves on to round number 2 with a 5.36 ET. Schaefer is going to come back, though, as a fast loser for round number 2. And then we jump right into Barefoot and Predator, the second matchup highlighted from round 1. And the zoomed in shot here of Barefoot is really awful. We kind of miss the whole full view of the truck as it launches off of the line. But, man, it's still a blowout race for Fred Schaefer as he goes on to cut a 5.06 ET.
Fred's moving pretty good. It still looks like he has a little bit in the bank because he pulls out on Pizzo pretty early. From what I understand, I was talking to a couple people some months ago about Fred's performance throughout these seasons, and I think he had Rich Cummings helping him at some of these events with the suspension, and Rich must have been with him this weekend because the suspension's absolutely dialed in all weekend on both Dodge trucks.
Oh, yeah. Both he and Deppy are performing really flawlessly to an extent. Deppy's going to have a little bit of an issue here in round number 2 coming up. We'll talk about, round 3 coming up, but we'll talk about that in a minute. This Barefoot Predator race, though, man, Alan Pizzo's not even in it. From whole shot to finish, this is a barefoot race. Pizzo, I mean, he could have just been eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on the line as far as I was concerned. Fred was gone and left Alan.
He was gone, but you know what? That run in the far lane from Pizzo, I still wouldn't call it necessarily a bad run. It's just the trucks are moving so fast now. Pizzo probably runs what? A high 5, which, a year or two ago would have been just fine, but we're down in the low 5s, 5.04 for Fred here, and, high 4s in qualifying, and who knows what's going to happen later in the weekend.
Yeah, if I had to put a time on it, I'd say Pizzo was about the 5.5, 5.7 range, but at this time, that's like almost a truck length. Over a truck length right there, that he's behind Fred at this point. Notes from round number 1, because they only highlighted round number 1. They didn't show all of the racing from round number 1. They cut right into what would be called the quarterfinals, which is the Elite 8. We get Power Wheels having a fast qualifier bye, and I'm assuming that the only reason that he had a bye in round number 1 is because of Overkill's incident from the day before.
That's right. So from what I can understand, they only really had 12 trucks at this event to start with, because in show 2, we also have a truck with a bye running round number 1. I think Schaefer gets it. And that would indicate that there was no 13th truck to step up and take that number 12 spot away from Overkill in the lineup. So it wasn't necessarily, I think, a matter of making the field here. You just had to stay alive and make sure you're ready to go when called upon.
Yep, and that's something that a lot of teams do very well. It kind of makes you wonder, though, where Executioner came from on day 2. I know we're jumping ahead just a little bit here, but Executioner not in day 1 makes you wonder if they called them in for day 2, or they just happened to be in the area and swung by.
I think they just lost in round 1, and that run didn't get shown. We only see 2 runs from round number 1. There's at least, 4 other races we didn't see. I'm
Yeah,
thinking
very
Executioner
true.
makes a round 1 exit.
Yep, that's very true. So if you guys were ever at this event in 1995, shoot us a message and let us know. It'd be cool just to kind of have that little bit of mystery solved in the monster truck world, where Executioner came from here. But anyway, pairings for round number 2, we've got Power Wheels Bigfoot taking on Fast Loser Monster Patrol, Rampage and Bigfoot, Moving Violation and Carolina Crusher, and then Barefoot and Fast Loser Boogie Van. Power Wheels and Monster Patrol is going to start us off here, and Dan Runte takes the right lane. That's not a shock at all. That's the lane he set Quick ET in the previous day. And Paul, he's in a lane that he was actually losing in round number 1, so he's got a familiarity with it. It's almost, to me, that's kind of like an even Steven between those two drivers right there. Hey, I've got experience over here, and this guy set Quick ET in this lane, but he hasn't ran very hard today yet. So he's got to have a little bit of confidence there built up for Paul.
Yeah, let's keep an eye on the lanes here and see if there really is much of a difference or preference between the drivers. Bigfoot, Power Wheels, the new look for 95. They did a little bit of tweaking on the scheme, get those logos a little bit bigger for the sponsors. And, Runte and Schaefer both kind of leave together, but you could see that Schaefer really stumbles over the first set of cars.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that left lane might just be a little bit muddy over there on the starting portion of the line, because at this point when they take off, Monster Patrol is just getting to the second set of cars as Power Wheels is crossing the finish line. This set the fastest ET of the day, by the way, a 4.93 for Power Wheels Bigfoot and Dan Runte, who's really kind of getting his coming out party in this season at this moment.
Yeah, Dan, I'm not going to say he got robbed in 94, but he goes into Indy as the points leader and has a transmission failure and more or less hands the championship to Andy Brass. I would have really loved to have seen those two truly battle it out on the racetrack and see who came out on top, because Runte had a career year in 94, start to finish, stepping up from the snakebite truck in 93 on the point series. And 95 is going to treat him a lot better overall in this season, but we see him get out of the truck here after this run, do an interview with Army, and you can just see the intensity that Dan has looking at Eric Meager going to the starting line, seeing what the next run's going to be like. They're keeping tabs on every run, every ET, what the truck's doing, how the lanes are developing. This is really the year, and even more so the event, where these guys really boil this whole monster truck racing down to a complete science, and they really start getting after the tiny, tiny little details that add up and make the difference on the racetrack.
Yeah, very true here. Army immediately grabs Dan, like you said, as soon as he gets out of the truck. And Dan says, Army says, Bigfoot going against Rampage here. Is there anything that the drivers ought to know? And Dan says, the right lane has really came around, Army. At the beginning of the race, we thought we were going to have a hooking condition, which hooking condition basically means it would throw the truck one side or the other. Trucks are going to go straight down that track as far as the right lane. Dan says, I haven't been in the left lane, but Eric should have a really good race here. He shouldn't have a problem at all. He does have a big problem, though, and that's the fact that Rampage is in the other lane, and those Dodges are really hooked up right here. And this race right here is actually a bit of a surprise as far as I'm concerned, because Ken Deppy goes out there and puts a whooping to Bigfoot.
Yeah, and I even slowed this down frame by frame when I was trying to do my notes for this show, and the two trucks literally start moving at the exact same time, and I think the difference here is the transmission. Rampage got the 3-speed Lenko with the slipper clutch in it, and they must have had that clutch dialed in tight for this weekend, because the truck's launching super, super hard. Bigfoot team, they're running a derivative of the Ford C6 transmission at this point, I believe, still, and they're launching hard. But if you go back and watch some of the end of year videos and some of the other analysis they do on their season, the Bigfoot team says that they struggle with transmission issues in Bigfoot 15 throughout the year. So I don't know if this is part of that, but Deppy just has an absolute stomper of a run end to end.
He goes out and sets quick time of the event so far with a 4.90 ET, fastest truck of the day so far in a lane that really nobody ever really wanted to hop into yet at this point. Like you said, Bigfoot 15 having transmission issues. That's something Bob Chandler mentions even in the Bigfoot 25th anniversary videotape years upon years later when they released that. They said Bigfoot 15, man, we can't keep we could not keep a transmission in it at first, but once they got it dialed, it was one of their better performing trucks. I put it right up there with 14 as far as the Penda Point series would go. It was either that truck or 14 that were always kind of back and forth with each other a little bit later on in this season, as well as the 96 season coming up.
Right. And, Bigfoot 15 really is the first time that they more or less carbon copied a complete truck off of what they already knew. If you
Mm-hmm.
look through the Bigfoot lineage in terms of the race trucks, you have 8, 9 is similar, but they did a lot of things different with the chrome ollie. The front suspension was different axles when it started out. So that truck was totally different. 10 goes to the rear engine. 11, another experimental truck. They changed the suspension up a little bit more, and they ran the John Causey Hemi in that truck. Bigfoot 12, originally supposed to be Bigfoot 10, ends up being a display truck. I guess you could call that a carbon copy of 9, but they knew it didn't work at that point, so that's why they put
Mm-hmm.
it on display duty. 14's built new, first truck without cantilevers in the race series, and then the next year you see 15 come out and it's basically the carbon copy. And I don't know, I'm sure there's a little bit of small differences here and there, but if you look at the two trucks visually on TV, they're pretty much identical. And even you look at the Dodge team, Rampage is running the belly engine truck from the year before that Fred had, and Fred has a new truck with
And Fred's
a
got a
little bit,
brand new piece basically for this
yeah,
season.
little bit different design there. And I'm not going to say which one necessarily works better because Rampage looks so good here. The run's just so smooth. He carries the rear tires down the first set of cars. The front tires never touch, until about 20 feet before the second ramp, and it just works for him.
Yeah, and the one thing that we can go into a whole different discussion right here, so let's kind of dip our toes into that area, and that's the fact that a lot of teams are still experimenting here, whether it be the Gravedigger team, the Bigfoot team, Barefoot, chassis design, chassis design, chassis design. There are so many different styles of chassis that are coming out right now. It's unreal. Dennis goes from Digger 3 to Digger 7 with not necessarily a radical change, but a different style of chassis as well. Then you see Bigfoot coming out, like you mentioned, with all of those different vehicles that they had built and different designs and different styles that they were trying. Fred Schaefer going from the belly chassis to this current chassis that he has underneath Barefoot, I think 12. It's just, I can't understand a lot of this, but I do see why they would be doing this. They're just trying to find something that's going to be the most consistent for these racing series.
Yeah, you dangle the carrot out there of prize money, and it's not like these guys are going out racing for $1 million that can really support this much development. But they had what, $50,000-$100,000 point fund at the end of the season. If you can get a decent chunk of that, it'll pay for your new chassis for the next year. And
Mm-hmm.
these guys are trying to figure out what works, and they're getting, like I said, this racing down to a science. Two totally different approaches. The Dodge team going with the long wheelbase, big power, not really worried about the suspension as much. The Ford team, a little shorter wheelbase, more suspension focus, and of course they're making big power anyway, but their main focus is suspension, diagnostics. We see later in the season Bob Chandler pulling out the computer and the diagnostic readings from the truck, and that's really, I think, where the difference ended up being for the Bigfoot team over Dodge, is they had the data to go back and tune and tune and tune every run, whereas Fred was kind of doing a little more old school from the drag racing mentality.
Yeah, Fred, to use an analogy that they used for Equalizer back in the day, pencil versus computer. Fred's still doing it via the pencil, and Bigfoot's in there with computers trying to dial everything down. And that's eventually what's going to help propel that team down the road. Next race, Carolina Crusher and Moving Violation GM products right here. Army gives the privateers a little bit of a boost here, referring to them as great billboards for some sponsors to get hooked up with. I love the fact that Army takes the time in this broadcast to say, hey, these guys could use a little money thrown their way.
Yeah, these guys are running almost completely out of their own pocket. We talked about, Welsh getting a little bit of support from Dairy Mart. Gary Porter had Big A Auto Parts behind him for a long period of time. I don't know if there was any money involved or if they were just kind of helping him with some parts or other things. But, compared to your Ford and Dodge teams that are paying for new haulers and, R&D development for the truck and getting a lot of money flowing in, these guys are very much on a different scale in terms of income from their sponsors. And it's amazing they can stay as competitive as they can with the budgets they had.
Yeah, one thing too to point out between these two vehicles that doesn't seem to be really to get mentioned all that much in Penda or really any other series is the different tire combinations that we see on these vehicles. Bigfoot's obviously running Firestone, Barefoot's got Goodyears on, Carolina Crusher's got Goodyears on, Moving Violation's got Firestones. They're still trying to figure out what tire is going to work and what cut is going to work on these tire. Porter here, like I said, running a pretty cut Goodyear tire takes down Welch running the Firestone tires, which was similar to cut to Bigfoot. But it doesn't surprise me if maybe that Mike Welch got those tires from Bigfoot to run on this truck. They look so similar. But Porter, like I said, wheels up start, gets the whole shot on Welch, similar to his round one pass, maintains the whole shot straight down the straightaway, point A to point B. Porter 5.41 ET.
Yeah, I think the difference here really is at the light. I mean, this Porter drills Welsh on the light here, gets that quick hole shot, and the trucks don't really change in interval at all throughout the rest of the race. So I'm going to say this is a whole shot win for Gary Porter.
Same thing he had in round one.
Yeah, I mean, Gary was always known for being fast on the light. He got burned a couple times back in the early 90s on a slow light, and he said, I'm never letting that happen again. And the rest of his career, he was on the light all the time. And a 5:14 is still a fast run, but they still got a little bit of work to go to catch the Ford and Dodge guys.
Yeah, just a little bit here. But was it 490, 493, and a 5:14, some of the fast times to mention here. That's literally a whole shot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and Army says, I think it might have been in this race that, Gary's going to go just fast enough to beat you, so he may have a little bit more in the tank yet.
Race to not abuse his equipment.
Right. So, Welsh, I got to give him credit. I mean, I love the way that truck looked personally. I thought it looked cool. I don't know if he had the racing version Firestones or if he had the ag version Firestones. And some of our listeners may not know. Firestone made a monster truck racing tire in the 90s, and they didn't make a ton of them. I don't know the whole story behind it. I think there was some kind of manufacturing error, and some of the racing tires got sent to ag customers, and that they put the kibosh on it after that. But there were monster truck racing tires that were lighter weight, made by Firestone. They looked the same, but had a lighter construction, and they were really the first purpose-built tire specifically for monster truck use.
Yep, exactly. So if anybody ever tells you BKT was the first ever produced monster truck specific racing tire, you are wrong, sir.
Oh, you got a bunch of them before that. You've got
there's so many before that, but I have heard that advertisement before of people trying to say, "Oh, BKT made the first purpose-built monster truck tire." No, they did not.
Oh, you get the marketing wank behind anything, you can make it sound good.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, never believe what you hear. We'll put that way, folks. Barefoot and Boogie Van up here, last race, round number 2. Pam Votters comes back as a fast loser to take on Fred Schaefer. Probably not the draw she was looking for, and it really kind of shows right here as Fred just lays it to the wood, takes out Boogie Van here in a pretty simple race, really.
Yeah, and, before this race, we get a segment with Army talking about some of the advancements and developments in monster truck racing, which I thought was kind of cool. He's doing it at the Boogie Van truck, giving the Votters team a little bit of exposure here, and talking about, engine placement, front versus rear, what the shock absorbers are doing nowadays. He calls them the Custer shock absorbers, and I think they were still making them in the Custer company at that time, Lance King involved, and then he would spin off on his own after Custer would shut down. And, low center of gravity. He says, I can't even walk underneath this truck because the cradle's so low on it. And
yeah, he talks just a few years prior about how he and Gary Lee could walk underneath these trucks. Now, not possible.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the cradle on Boogie Van, and it's basically at Army's, kneecaps. It's a low slung truck.
Yeah, very low slung truck here. They're trying to move those motors down as far as they can, and I think that this all started around this era, and it's still something that these guys fiddle with to this day on these trucks. I mean, Monster Jam has come out with some different chassis designs here lately, just to try and tweak that CRD to try and get the motor lower and lower and lower even more. Son of a Digger is probably the biggest example of this, and I'll just throw Ryan out there under the bus. Hey, Ryan, I know you listen. How's it going, buddy? But his truck sits so low sometimes that the lower linkage on the trucks, the lower links, are actually at a negative angle.
Well, and that's not a bad thing for performance,
No, it's
Again,
not bad
we get into the RC side of it, and And a lot of our trucks, their ride height is pretty much at Link's level. So, the performance is definitely stepping up. And those guys down in Carolina, they care about winning. Don't let them fool you when they say they're just going out and doing the freestyle for the fans. Those boys want to win when it comes out on the racetrack.
Yeah, the biggest thing that you're going to learn in Monster Jam is, oh, we do this all for you guys. No, they do it for you guys. Don't get me wrong, but man, they care about winning. I've been cornered by some of those guys. I used to work there. No, I'm just kidding, guys. I'm not throwing anybody under the bus. I'm just saying that there is a lot of competitive nature that still goes on to this day, and that dates all the way back to about, I don't know, the second they started racing these trucks.
Right. And you talk about the competitive nature. I'm pretty sure that this is a new Boogie Van truck compared to the one that they had been running before in the series. I pulled up, a late 93 race here for Penda, and Boogie Van, the first edition, just kind of has a simple V truss in the middle with the longer 4-link bars. And we come here to Lima, a year and a half later, the truck's got an elongated cradle. So I don't know if Mike, bottom half the truck or if they built a completely new chassis. I don't have a great lineage on his chassis history in front of me, but I'm sure some of our listeners will know whether that truck was a complete rebuild or revamped. But I just wanted to point that out. They're really going after these points too, and Pam really does a good job here by the end of the 95 season.
Yeah, that she does. One comment here that gets thrown around is, as we said, it appeared it had rained before this event. The grass area is still very slick. The racing surface itself, they have flawlessly prepared. The actual grass, though, is something that is still very slick. As soon as Boogie Van lands, she does a complete 180 as soon as she gets on the brakes. And Gary Lee pops up with something that jumped out to me and something kind of made me smile. He says, Joey Chitwood would be proud of that move. For those that don't know, Joey Chitwood was a daredevil. Chitwood was known to be the first man to wear a safety belt during the Indianapolis 500. He finished fifth. That was his best finish in the Indy 500. I believe he did it twice. He also went to set a record driving a Chevrolet Corvette for driving over 5 miles on 2 wheels. Hey, we tossed Ryan Anderson out there earlier. Ryan, you step your game up just a little bit there, buddy.
Chitwood was amazing. I got to see the Joey Chitwood stunt show when I was a kid. I don't think Joey was driving anymore, but I mean, the precision driving those guys do is absolutely incredible. And, Gary making that reference there, it certainly, rings home. A precision spin like that and stopping it on a dime. Pam did a good job of keeping that truck, underneath her in a very, very slick condition.
Yeah, very slick for Pam Botters right there. Slick for barefoot as well. I mean, slow for barefoot at a 5.08. That seemed a bit conservative for him, but like I said, point A to point B pass right there. I think he kind of felt like he had that round one.
Yeah, I think he backed out of it just a hair. And, they get to the interview. Army pulls Fred out of the truck, and Fred says, we're building a strong team. We're looking forward to a good year. I think they're going to have a good weekend, but boy, the year kind of unravels by the end of the season, unfortunately for them.
Gary Lee says before commercial break, beware the bear. A little bit of foreshadowing right there as we go into the semifinals.
Yeah, we head into the semifinals, first race. Now we're getting down to the nitty gritty here. We've got Power Wheels Bigfoot versus Rampage. Each of these trucks pretty much are the cream of the crop. We've got one Chevrolet left in the field with Carolina Crusher, and we're going to see what he does in the next race here. But Deppy and Runte, they're going to go after it.
Yeah, and the one thing that we got to point out here is the lane choice. Deppy ran a faster time than Runte did in the previous round. This is kind of the era now where we're really getting into racing. We've complained on this podcast before about how if you were number one qualifier, you had lane choice all the way through the bracket. Not the case anymore. You had to run a time quick enough in the previous round to keep your lane choice advantage. Power Wheels does not do that here, and Rampage gets lane choice. And the interesting thing is Deppy goes from the left lane to the right, and I think that's a mistake. He ran a 490 in the previous left lane pass. I think he should have stayed over there. He was more consistent over there at that point, I feel like. Runte gets thrown over there, and what happens?
Yeah, Runte takes the win here. And Deppy, I can understand the decision going to the right lane because he was the only guy to win out of left lane so far in the day from what we seems like. And I'm sure Fred's telling him, hey, the right lane's still the place to be. Go over there. And Ken doesn't get the best launch over that first set of cars. He's already behind, and then you can see he backs out of it as
Yeah, he
he's
just
landing.
completely backs out after the first jump. Once he knows he's not in the race anymore with Runte, he saves the equipment. Smart driver.
Yeah, and Ken's been known to get wild and crazy on occasion. He'll get real crazy in Canfield later in the season, but definitely making sure he saves the equipment and get to the next day.
Power Wheels goes from point A to point B really quick, gets the W, 4.91 ET, which at this point is the second fastest time of the day, and only by .01. That's hard to believe. These guys are within they're so close with one another. Like I said, you could be running a 480 to a 50 ET time, and that's literally the whole shot.
It's the whole shot, and it looks like a huge margin of victory at that point too on
Yeah.
the camera. The trucks are moving so fast at the finish line. It's literally coming down to the hundredths of seconds for these runs. Runte comes out of the truck. We're talking about the lane difference here. Dan comes out and says, you know what? Both lanes are coming around, and I'm not afraid to go back in that left lane if I have to.
Yeah, he's not afraid to go back into that left lane. Keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, as we move on to Barefoot and Carolina Crusher right here. Fred pushes Gary to the left side of the track, and honestly, that's the smartest move Fred could have made right there. We cut to a clip of Gary being interviewed right before this race, and they talk about the shocks on Carolina Crusher. 26 inches of travel on those comb shocks, which are a little bit different than some of the ones that we had been previously talking about out there. Of course, Steve Combs of Night Stalker fame and Monster Truck Racing made the shocks that are on Gary's truck, and they're working really well up to this point for Gary.
Yeah, I mean, Steve really had the first widely, easily available nitrogen shock setup that you could just go ahead and buy off the shelf, more or less. The Bigfoot team had worked with, their suppliers over the years and had their own setup and kind of had a deal with Trailmaster going for development. But if you wanted nitrogen shocks as a monster truck owner and you were an independent, Steve Combs is the guy.
Yeah, he was the guy to call at that particular time. Army then cuts and starts to explain how the starting line for Penda works. Much like drag racing, we have a pre-stage and a stage light. Once both trucks are staged, they must wait until the green comes on. Speaking of green, it's even off the, Speaking of green, it's even off the line. However, the shocks that Gary was just talking about really hurt him on this pass. Porter pulls a wheel stand over that first set of cars. I don't know if he had adjusted those before the race or if he just hooked up when he hit those cars, because it looks like with the power that they're pulling off the line, it would not have shocked me whatsoever if he hooked on the start, popped the wheels up, caught the front tires on the cars, and it just popped it into a wheel stand because his rears were biting so much.
Yeah, and I don't think he let out of it either. He definitely didn't roll the first set. He knew he couldn't. The Dodge guys are pretty much, singing wide open the whole way down the track at this point. And it's unfortunate because Gary gets out of shape, ends up missing the second set of cars, DQs himself. If he'd have had a perfect run, he'd have had a chance at winning because Fred kind of loses power over the second set. Still, somehow cuts a 501 ET. Are you kidding me? With losing power right before the second set of cars, he'd have been in the 470 range, I think, had he kept under power.
Yeah, I mean, we would have been talking about another world record pass right there. And initially, when I first watched this, I had forgot that he actually lost power. I thought that the truck just, like, he let out. I thought he let out because he knew he had the race over Porter. And then immediately it cuts back in and they say Barefoot's got an electrical issue, that the engine was killed over the final set of cars. And a 501 with the motor being cut is still an incredible time. Imagine what he could have ran right there. He may have been in the 460s with that pass. He was definitely on it in that round right there.
It was Fred's run of the event so far, and even so, Gary unfortunately DQs out, but I'm gonna say Fred got a little lucky in that race as well.
Yeah, I think a little bit of luck helps you out every now and then. We move on into the final round, though. Power Wheels, Bigfoot, and Barefoot. Probably the two that you wanted to see get to the finals. This is the battle of 1 and 2 in qualifying, and this is the battle right here of Ford and Dodge that would go down to the very last race of the season, really. Bob Wilder of Dodge Trucks is shown right here, standing and looking on at Barefoot as they're trying to repair a magneto issue to get it ready to go. Dan is going to take the right lane, even though he said he wasn't afraid to go to the left again. I believe that it's a mistake to do that because you got that lane that you just ran in fresh in your mind. I don't know why you would want to just swap back and take the other lane. I think that was a mistake right there for Dan.
Yeah, Dan, feels confident on either side, and I'm guessing that he still thinks the right lane's the place to be, but we see as they leave the line here, the Dodge, again, there's no matching the power and the hookup. It's been cloudy all day. Well, now for the finals, it's suns out, guns out.
Oh yeah, sun's out, guns out, and Fred Schaefer fires off a six-shooter in this lane over here. Left lane pulls another world record time out of a 4.72, and I got to tell you, the Barefoot team is incredibly happy with that.
Similar to how Deppy rolled off that first set of cars, in the round previous where he rode the wheelie most of the way through no man's land. Fred basically does the same thing here, and I think the difference in this run really is how the trucks come off the first set of cars. Runty doesn't do a bad job, but he keeps the front end down a little bit more. Fred just hits that perfect balance of that slingshot effect, riding the rear wheels down that first set of cars, and it gives him the truck length boost throughout no man's land to take the win.
472 world record time here for Fred Schaefer. We go into the points. Barefoot 2300, Carolina Crusher 2040, Rampage at 1220, Power Wheels 1050, and Monster Patrol at 990. Barefoot team is extremely happy here, and Fred's shaking everybody's hand after this one.
Yeah, Kathy's running up underneath the truck to tell him the time. Ken Deppy's real happy. I mean, you can see how elated the Dodge team is here to take the win and the world record in the same shot.
Exactly here. When the Dodge team rolled in, the sun came out, and boy, it feels good to be in the winner's circle. We should point out here, too, Fred Schaefer did not have a win to his credit in 1994. This is his first win in a year in monster truck racing on the Penda circuit, at least. So you can imagine just how happy they are, as well as the Dodge team.
Yeah, I mean, Dodge and Chrysler Corporation had their money behind this team. I'm sure they're expecting results. This is their outlet. Some of the promotional videos I've seen for Trucks and Tractor Power that they sent to their sponsors talks about, how many truck owners there are that watch this show and, the engagement that these customers do. And this is how they sold the sponsorships, not only for the TV show to advertisers, but I'm sure that the teams were using this as promotional material as well to say, hey, if we go out and win, we can show your products and give you some revenue in terms of vehicle sales. And this is when trucks were really, really exploding on a consumer level, going from the off-roading and tradesman type of consumer to every family needs a truck in their garage.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a practice that they still do to this day. Somewhere in my my mass media collection here that I have an Amsoil shock therapy promo that shows exactly how many people that they thought they had performed in it's a 5-minute little clip of the video talking about every show that they went to as far as Monster Jam in first quarter, and at the very end of it they show you exactly how many people they performed in front of and how many eyes they had on the Amsoil product for that, and thanked Amsoil for their continued participation in sponsoring that vehicle. And man, let me tell you, that's something that started probably in this era with these guys trying to get as much money as these trucks as they can, because they really felt like this was going to go somewhere and it was going to be one of, if not one of the truck motorsport in America. We'll put it that way.
Army always brought up the old adage from racing: you win on Sunday, you sell on Monday. And Dodge is doing a good job of it here.
We're back here, ladies and gentlemen. Day number 2 for Lima, Ohio. And we've got a special guest joining us here. We've got Matt Stoltz, and we've got Mark Fontanetta right here as well. Mark, what's going on, man?
Not too much, considering that what we're talking about has been, 25 years now already?
Yeah. Well, it is the retro Monster Truck Review, so got to talk old school.
My memory's probably just as good as my dad's, too. But we were talking earlier about it, and we'll chime in at that time.
Yeah, that sounds good here. Lineup from day 1 changes just slightly here. We got Fred Schaefer and Barefoot, Dan Runty, Power Wheels, Bigfoot and Eric Meager, Carolina Crusher with Gary Porter, Rampage and Ken Deppy, Monster Patrol, Paul Schaefer, Predator, Alan Pizzo, Dan Patrick chimes in with Samson, Moving Violation, Brian Welch, and then Executioner pops in out of nowhere for day number 2 here. And so far to this date, this has been the fastest weekend in monster truck racing history, with it ending up with Fred Schaefer with a 472 ET in the final round of the previous day here. And I got to tell you, Matt, 250-foot course, 472 ET from Fred Schaefer. I think there's some more speed out there.
There's probably a little more speed, and the big story really is, We're now on race 3 of the season, and no wins for the Bigfoot team. We've got Carolina Crusher with a points win, Barefoot with a points win. The Fords are sitting on a big goose egg so far in 1995.
Yeah, we got a Chevrolet we had a Chevrolet in winner circle. We got a Dodge in the winner circle. No Ford victories. No Toyota victories. Just throw out another stat there. But anyway, Mark, you were actually here at this event. From sitting in the stands, what do you remember from qualifying and say round number 1?
Round number 1 from qualifying, it's just like you guys said, there was a lot of speed going into it. And this was pretty much when the Dodge guys got me into liking the Dodge trucks in general. Because right now, if you look out my apartment window, there is a Dodge Dakota sitting outside. But yeah, that's mostly what I remembered. And I remember how frustrated Bigfoot was that weekend because they're like, this is the second race of the year and we've got nothing to show for it. So I thought it was interesting. But even as a kid looking at that, I'm remembering that stuff.
And that's the stuff that announcers like Gary Lee and Army Armstrong would entwine into all of us and down the road is just how much the racing meant. And I think that's why there's still a lot of old school fans that stick around to this day that complain about the racing broadcast not being as what they would consider to be up to par with what Gary and Army do right here. Gary opens the second day of competition comparing the 4-wheel drive racing to school. And I think it's hilarious. It's an amazing analogy. And if you just go back and listen to this intro and you hear some of the stuff that's Gary saying, it makes you chuckle even to this day, 20 some odd years later. And we go in here. The usual suspects make up your top spots in qualifying. And at this time, it's Barefoot taking the TQ time here over Power Wheels. And man, guys, I got to tell you, there's the Dodge team and the Ford team. It's flip-flopping back and forth this whole weekend.
Yeah, and, Army goes into his kind of pitch for the show and saying, the Fords are doing what they need to do now. They're just going one round at a time, but Dodge is doing the same thing, and the difference here today is they're on opposite sides of the bracket.
Yeah, they're all the teams are on opposite sides of the bracket. The Fords are on one side, the Dodge is on the other. And just for a comparison's sake here, the Bigfoot hauler that they're showing right here, I loved it. Classic Bigfoot hauler that they have shown in the background right here. The champions from 92, 93, and 94. I mean, they're in a hole right now, but they're still looking good doing it with that hauler that they're bringing at every event. I love the fact that old school hauler is there with the old Bigfoot truck on it.
It looks so good. And, Kramer used that artwork on his hauler all the way back in the late 80s, and it was an iconic look for sure. There's an Ertl toy of it. One of the first haulers to ever come out for a toy for a monster truck, and it was that, consistent of a look.
Anybody that listens to this show, whenever you see this link posted in the Monster Truck Collecting Facebook page, I've been looking for that hauler for a long time. Hit me up if you have one.
Hey, I got a nice useless fact. That hauler is actually in the background of Roadhouse when he smashes through the car dealership.
Yeah, there's a quick little glimpse of it that you can catch back there with that old school Bigfoot hauler in number 7 when it goes through that. That's one thing I should actually one of these episodes, and I'm throwing this out there for anybody that's listening, I just need to review monster trucks in movies. And that would probably be the end all be all right there for me. That was one of my favorite clips from Roadhouse. But anyway, we go in here and like I said, the champions from the last 3 years are Team Bigfoot. But right now, they aren't in the top 5 in points. They aren't in the top 3 in points. Power Wheels is in 4th in points with their at the time. I'm pretty sure that between Dan Renzi and Eric Meager, they're still trying to figure out who the number 1 driver in Bigfoot's going to be. So I imagine they're kind of racing for it right now. And the guy that's leading the Bigfoot charge, anyway, as far as I'm concerned, Matt, is Dan Renzi.
Yeah, they're kind of a 1 and a 1A at this point. Meager's got what we'd call the premier ride, the marquee name, the Bigfoot truck. But Runty, running the Power Wheels scheme, a little bit more comfortable, wanted that truck from last year. It's a toss-up as to who's really got the better equipment. They're both so good. Both are good drivers that are getting a number of years' experience under their belt at this point. And, they just want to go out and have a 1-2 punch like they have the last couple of years in the Penda Series. Yeah,
and that's something that they've got a lot of work to do. Like we said, Team Bigfoot and a Ford in general has not been in victory lane in the first 2 events here, and that's a surprise, means they have won the last 3 world championships in Penda. Army does a good job here of hyping this Ford and Dodge rivalry that's been developing the last couple of years. Dodge has been on the losing end of that, And now they are the ones that are walking away with it as we go into round one highlights. Rampage and Monster Patrol. The right lane from day one still seems to be sought after in day number 2 here, and there is no surprise to see Ken Deppy push Paul Schaefer to the left side of the track. And we see probably one of Deppy's best runs ever. They mistakenly say that Deppy just set his fastest time ever. We know now that that's not true. The day before, actually, he ran a 490. Here he runs a 491 in round number 1. And I got to tell you, those Dodge trucks, they're within 0.2 of a second of each other the entire weekend.
For sure. And, again, another rough run for Paul Schaefer and Monster Patrol. He had some bad luck this weekend in Lima. He just couldn't quite get the whole run together. He'd get through that first round, no problem, but get to round 2 and he'd struggle a little bit. So he'd come on a lot more here later in the season, though.
And they say that Samson's pass right here is from round number 1. We see Dan Patrick have some issues. It looks like he loses the transmission in the middle of no man's land, and then the front of the truck kind of noses into the cars, and it breaks a Heim joint on the front end. It just kind of messes the steering up. It's never good when your wheels are facing the opposite direction of each other. I'm kind of curious though, Mark, being that you're in here, where do you remember seeing and standing at for some of this?
So I was going to say, I can chime in on both of those things with Monster Patrol and Samson.
Yeah, by all means.
I'm trying to think of where exactly I was in the grandstands. We usually tried to sit in the center so we could see the whole thing, like a couple rows up to where it's high enough above everybody else so you can see the whole track, and then where you can look to the left and the right and you got the whole thing. I remember Monster Patrol's run and him bouncing around like he does because he does a gnarly nosedive. We thought he was going over. And then I always liked when Samson had his little issue. I shouldn't really say that because, he was out broken. But it always looked like the truck punched the cars.
That's actually funny, actually.
Literally American Gladiators type stuff. It's just like wham, right into the cars.
That's a cool take, Mark.
That would be what would be said.
I never thought of it that way, Mark, but I mean, you look at the video and he pretty much gives him a straight up center punch on the chin to that car. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, Samson actually punches the cars harder than Floyd Mayweather punched. Who did he fight last weekend? I forgot his name. Oh, Paul.
Logan Paul.
Yeah, Logan Paul.
Oh, you know what that actually reminds me of? The movie Hot Rod, when the dude tries to do the ultimate punch.
There you go.
and this issue for Dan is something that isn't just isolated to this weekend here in Lima. Later in the year, he has a catastrophic axle housing failure in Indianapolis, and they go and they look at this and they say, well, this issue really stems back to Lima, where the housing was fractured internally and they couldn't tell because it was inside the housing. They couldn't tell the metal was deformed. They did further damage at Bloomsburg where they bent the housing, and then the whole thing just lets loose in Indy. So, Dan, being the metallurgist and the engineering mind that he is, was able to trace the issues all the way back multiple months to this issue in Lima.
All from punching the cars right there. We go into round number 2 here, and we see the pairings. Barefoot and Executioner, which is a cool matchup. Predator and Rampage. Carolina Crusher and Bigfoot. Then Power Wheels and Moving Violation. We go right into Barefoot and Executioner, and I kind of want to point this out. This is almost foreshadowing right here as far as the Dodge sponsorships goes, because we see Tim Hall and Executioner right here. At this point, I believe it's a Chevrolet taking on the Barefoot Dodge, but it's almost like a passing of, not necessarily a passing of the torch yet, but like I said, foreshadowing to what would come in 2002 for the Hall Brothers team.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the factory Dodge team here, Fred Schaefer and Barefoot, and they would end up, terminating their agreement on one side or the other in 1997. Dodge gets out of it for a few years, and when they come back with the Hall Brothers, and you see this run here round 2 from Barefoot and Executioner, and the trucks kind of leave together, but at this point, Fred's 471 just outpasses everybody on the track, and the Hall Brothers would continue to get more competitive over the next year and a half through the rest of the Penda series, and they would get a little bit more on pace. They'd be running low fives and so forth, but they'd become one of the most successful teams in the industry, and we're seeing not necessarily the infancy, but maybe the preteen years of the Hall Brothers.
I mean, this is the first time that Dodge representatives are getting a good look here at the Hall Brothers. And like we said, Down the road a little ways, from 2002 on, Mark Hall would go on to win 12 of 16 special events racing championships, and Team Hall Brothers would end up 13 of 16, with Jeremy Dishman sneaking in there and stealing one championship away. Between the years from 2001 to 2016, the Hall Brothers have really turned into, and probably still are, a juggernaut as far as racing goes and monster truck racing, all because of that Dodge sponsorship that they have.
And it's a testament to how hard those guys have worked. We see them here in the Penda series. You know, they want to be competitive. They get faster each time out, and they didn't, have a whole lot of backing at that point. And then we see them through the Motor Madness years in USA Motorsports. They get more competitive, start taking round wins. They go into the Monster Jam era of Motor Madness in '99, do a few shows, and then they get the Dodge power behind them as an independent in 2000, and that's when things really start taking off, and they get the eyes of the Chrysler people, and they become the factory team.
Mm-hmm. They were the team that could compete with Bigfoot out there.
I'm going to tell you something interesting about the Hall brothers in that instance, too. Take a look at the chassis that they're running in that show and how high that thing stands. It's almost like a belly dragger chassis.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was interesting how, I don't want to say it was low tech at the time, considering everybody was tube framed and all that fun stuff. But look at their technology then compared to what they have now. They almost have Fred's equipment now compared to then. And I think, I could be wrong, or it could be the other executioner truck that had it. That's an Oldsmobile motor in there.
Yeah, I believe you're right there.
Yeah, the Hall brothers always kind of do their own thing, and they do what they know works. And as far as I know, they still build their chassis in-house, which is impressive, too. They build some fast racing machines there in Champaign, Illinois.
Yeah, they certainly do. They've got a new one on the blocks. Last time I was there, they've still had it sitting there for a little while, and Mark Hall was welding on it. They've got another one they're trying to build up. But here, let's go back into the retro portion of this. We kind of got a little sidetracked there talking about the Hall brothers. But Barefoot, no surprise, takes the right lane. And Fred goes out here and, again, breaks a world record, setting a 471 ET on the 250-foot track by 0.01, 100th of a second better than his final round from the previous day. I got to tell you, Fred Schaefer and Barefoot are completely dialed in right here.
For sure. And, Mark, being there at the time, were they playing up all this ET wars to the crowd live as it was happening?
I was going to say that was something that really wasn't, I can't remember. Because if I'm not mistaken, special events had two announcers. One guy was really old and annoying, and the other guy was really young and didn't exactly talk all that much. But when he did, he got going. I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been the young guy, but you really just couldn't hear it over the trucks. But we knew things were going on for sure. And actually, the interesting fact, if I'm not mistaken, that world record still hasn't been broken on a track like that.
The 471, it'll get broken a couple more times here.
Oh, definitely on this weekend, but the final record, that still stands.
Yeah.
It's kind of a testament to not only I'll give Barefoot the pat on the back and Fred too. That's lasted how many years? Almost 30 years at this point.
Yeah, I believe just to talk about the world record, it's going to eventually get lowered, and I'm not going to give away the time here, but Fred does beat the world record one more time later this season in Indianapolis, and that's the record that stands to this day as far as the 250-foot track goes.
I think if any of us have played Monster Truck Madness, we've probably beat that on there too.
But hey, MTM2 is MTM2, and I'm pretty sure I'm faster than Fred Schaefer, at least online. But anyway, we go into the next race here. Another big Dodge Rampage taking on Predator. And I love Gary Lee, who almost doesn't even know what to say to Predator. It's a curious-looking creation. He kind of says right there, he's not wrong. However, the truck does look iconic and always had. And it's one thing that jumps out to me is with the popularity of cats on the internet right now, how Alan Pizzo hasn't tried to put this truck out there more is beyond me. Because it seems like every time you're scrolling through Facebook, before you put your phone up for at least a little while, you're going to end up seeing at least, 75 videos of cats jumping off couches or trying to jump on counters or just ruining someone's day with their annoyingness. That's why I have a dog. But anyway, we scroll on and we see what happens right here. And I got to tell you, Deppy looks flawless as well right here, pulling another 509 ET. A little bit slower than Fred, but still right there. Like I said earlier in the previous show, a 509 and a 472 or 471. That's still a whole shot could separate the win right there between these guys. That's just how close this is on this 250-foot track between the Dodge, the Fords, and the Chevrolets.
Yeah, for sure. And Deppy comes out of that race saying, we're trying to stay on the throttle as much as we can over that first set of cars because, like we talked about earlier, these races are coming down to less than a tenth of a second in a lot of cases in the ETs and your lane choice as well. So every little detail and everything you do during that run matters.
Yeah, and right now the Dodge trucks are really working completely flawlessly at this point. We scroll on, though, and we move to a Chevrolet Ford matchup, the classic here between Carolina Crusher and Bigfoot. Number 15 has not had any luck whatsoever, and Meager might have something here as he pushes Porter to the left side of the track. Army mentions that Meager literally has the toughest seat in the sport right now, taking over for Andy Brass, who dominated in Bigfoot the last few years. Brass, like we said, won championships in number 10 and number 11, and now here in number 15, a truck they've been having transmission issues with. He's trying to prove himself and really show that he's worthy to take over that name of Bigfoot in this series. And man, one thing to touch really quick, I don't know how many people know this, but when Andy Brass left Bigfoot, he went to go try his hand in circle track racing in the infancy of the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series. Man, he didn't have a very good go of it. I can still remember Benny Parsons. They cut to a clip of Andy kind of spun. I want to say it was ORP, or no, it was IRP, I think. I could be wrong. Shoot me in the comments later. But Brass is spun out on the track, and we hear, I think Benny Parsons say, "Oh, it's Bigfoot."
And it speaks to Andy's brand recognition of being a monster truck driver. I mean, he was kind of the guy in that era. I mean, other than him and Dennis Anderson, those were the two top guys, Bigfoot and Gravedigger, in terms of driver recognition that was almost equal to the truck.
Yeah, 100% right there. I'm gonna have to find that clip again and see Andy spinning out in the truck. They don't really show, if I remember right, they don't really show a replay of it, but I always found it interesting. I know Andy kind of wanted to get off the road a little bit, and that's part of the reason that he pulled out of running with Bigfoot. He kind of wanted to get back and be a more homebodied oriented guy, and it worked out for Andy. Take nothing away from Andy. The man basically helped keep Bigfoot on the map in the early 90s, and Dan Runte takes over from there, as well as Eric Meager and anybody else that's driven a Bigfoot truck. As far as popularity goes, though, Andy Brash and Jim Kramer are the two guys that get talked about just about as much as Dan Runte these days, as far as the nostalgia crowd goes. And I got to tell you, it's really cool here to see Eric Meager come out in this Bigfoot truck and do as well as he does in this event, knowing how much pressure is on his shoulders as far as the fans go at this point.
He's got big shoes to fill, and that's not just because it's a Bigfoot that left them. It's you've got Ford behind you, you've got all your other sponsors, and this is really the first kind of picture-perfect run we see out of Meager in the 95 season, and it's a good one.
Well, I mean, you could go back to the Indy qualifying pass that he had, but unfortunately the truck was out from that point on after the transmission issues that it had. Did not have a good run in in Lima the day before. And like we covered that just a little bit ago, how it seemed like the truck he had the lane that he wanted. He thought he was going to get from point A to point B. Even Dan Runte's cheering him on in the back there. And then all of a sudden he doesn't go. And Deppy moves on and just floors it past him right here. But then Carolina Crusher this day, not Gary Porter's day, as Eric Meager just flat pounces him right here in Bigfoot.
Yeah, well, and something to check out here is Porter still got him on the light too. So
yeah, Porter gets him on the light. I forgot to mention that Porter does get him on the light.
Yeah,
but
Meager
then
drives around him.
Yeah, Meager drives around him and ends up getting the win. They say by a fender, but it's really about a half a truck length victory right there. One thing I'm curious about, since we have a man that was actually at this event, the absence of Andy Brass, was the crowd reaction any different between I mean, I'm sure you were probably at some events with Andy Brass behind the wheel. He always seemed to get a really good reaction. Did Eric Meager get a less of a reaction being behind the wheel of Bigfoot, being that he's not Andy Brass?
Yes and no. I think fans like us back then knew that wasn't Andy Brass.
Mm-hmm.
But fans, I hate the term your average fan or your basic fan, but they just knew somebody was driving Bigfoot, and as long as Bigfoot did good, that's what mattered to the majority of the people there. Because, like you were saying earlier, with Dodge versus Ford and Chevy versus this, and Bigfoot versus the world, they just wanted their favorite driver to win, and everybody's favorite driver, a majority of the time, was Bigfoot.
Yeah, you make a fair point right there. One thing that happens right after this, we see probably a little bit more of the transmission issues here that Bigfoot 15 has had, as we see Eric Meager immediately climb out of the truck and go underneath of it, and Army Armstrong practically has to drag him from working on the truck to come over and take an interview. It's kind of funny because when Army grabs him, Eric doesn't even know who's grabbing him. He's looking left, he's looking right, like, what the heck? And then he realizes, oh, I'm on TV.
Yeah, Eric's still a little bit new to the TV thing, and he says that they're picking up a vibration over the second set of cars. So I'm not sure if it's a drive shaft or if it's in transmission somewhere, but they've got a little work to do here before the next round.
Yeah, and I like the way that Army asks the question right here. What characteristic tells you that there's something wrong with the truck? And then Eric simply answers, there was a vibration over the second set. I called back on the Racing Electronics radio to the crew to let them know there was a problem right away, so we could get the time frame, so we could work within the time frame that we had to get the truck back out. Very well spoken by Eric Meeker, by the way, right here. I mean, he was straight to the point. He got the interview done, exactly what Army needed, and then he was right back to work.
And more importantly, he got that sponsor name in there. Gene Patterson was always a top guy for that. Andy Brass, the guys on the Bigfoot team always made sure to get those sponsor names in those interviews.
Speaking of big-time sponsors for Bigfoot, last race, round number 2 right here, Power Wheels and Moving Violation. And I got to tell you, I was a little surprised on this one right here. I thought that Dan Rente would just walk away from Moving Violation. Not the case right here. A great race between these two.
Good tight race, and we're talking about the differences in the times. A tenth of a second, maybe not even 2/10 of a second is a truck length. Runte takes the win with a 4.86. I'm willing to bet that Welsh goes under 5 seconds here.
Yeah, I'm going to say Welch was probably in the 490 range, 495, 496 maybe. Just maybe a tenth of a second off of Dan right here. And I love Army right here. Dan Runte flying with a 486. You got the other Bigfoot truck next round. What happens at a time like this when you're racing your best friend? I love the way Army does that, and you can kind of see Dan just kind of laugh a little bit, almost like he's thinking before he really has to answer this question. And he goes, yeah, Army, we're best of friends. They're both Fords. We can't lose as far as this one goes. They're both hooking up and running well. We're looking to move another points place today. Speaking of his team, particularly the Power Wheels team, they're looking to go from 4th to 3rd in points.
Yeah, Dan said it perfectly. We can't lose, so I'm going to go for it. And Army is a tremendous storyteller, and he had the amazing knack to be able to see the story as it's developing and capitalize on that for the viewers at home. And I think that's why so many of us are so endeared to him in the way that he was a broadcaster, because he got the storylines going, and our society really lives and dies by the story. We tell stories, and that's how drama happens. That's all of our TV shows. I mean, that's what sells entertainment, is the story behind it. So Army was an absolute master at that for sure.
Yeah, and to go on with that, Army literally says, when you say you can't lose, the big question is it you or him? Who's going to win? And then Dan, you see that another smile from Dan. That's something that's going to have to be determined out there on the light. I love the way Dan says that right there. One thing I do want to ask Mark really quick. Army's here at this event. Is he ever on the live mic at all during any of this, or is it just those two guys that you had mentioned earlier?
It was usually the two other guys. There was some driver interviews that he would do, or it would kind of go to the big stadium mic that I can remember. And I'll actually tell you a quick story about Army and how everybody's endured to him. He actually gave me and my brother 2 Ford models. They were I'm going to say ready to run in lack of a better term. But they were Ford models of the F-150 to 90, I want to say 94, 95 F-150. And he personally walked up to me and my brother and gave these to me, started talking to my dad and all that fun stuff. And yeah, definitely fond memories of him back in the day. And I actually wanted to chime in about moving violations as well. He should have been more consistent. He should have had more wins under his belt when it came to Penda, because he had the same horsepower, same equipment that Paul Schaefer did. Because they weren't neighbors, but they were from neighboring towns. Because Paul was from Westville, and Brian was from what was it, Maryville or Griffin? One of the two, both off of Route 30 down in Indiana. And he should have been doing a lot more, and he never got to, or he never made it that far, and it was always a shame. And I've honestly have stories about him where he's in the pits complaining. He's like, "Why ain't I beating Bigfoot? Why ain't I beating Barefoot? Why ain't I beating these guys?" And we're like, you got to use your throttle a little more.
Well, and to play
held back. Nothing against Brian. I hope he's not listening and saying, "This little punk kid."
Well, and Mark, to Brian's point, he probably just ran the lowest ET of his career, and it's a fantastic run. It just so happens that in the other lane is Fred Schaefer running just that smidge better. So it had to be discouraging for him, as a competitor. He's finally getting a little bit of money behind him with Dairy Mart. He's got the new engine, the Keith Black Hemi. He's got the cut Firestones. He's going after it. The combination, should work, and I'm going to say it is working. It's just that tiny edge in motorsports that you're always looking for, and this weekend he just happened to draw against the wrong guys.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's kind of like in NASCAR right now. It seems like Hendrick Motorsports has the edge in NASCAR. Before that, it was Joe Gibbs Racing. Before that, it was a Ford team. It was Stuart Haas Racing. Now it just seems like that little bit of edge just kind of bounces back and forth between all these teams, except in this particular era of monster truck racing, it seems to always want to back the blue, if you know what I mean. We go into the semifinal round. Barefoot and Rampage, Bigfoot and Power Wheels, a battle of two different teams here. So we are guaranteed a Ford and Dodge final, boys.
Yeah, it's you got the two team trucks going up against each other. You put your best foot forward on either side of the bracket, and who's going to have the hot hand at the end of the day.
Well, the hot hand seems to be dealt to a big red Dodge named Barefoot. As Barefoot and Rampage get ready to come out here, Army Armstrong interviews both of them, and they're both smiling. I think they're both really happy that they're in the semifinals regardless. Army comes out and says, "Fred, when you put this kid in the seat, you knew he could drive the truck. Now he's coming after you." Fred says he's pretty tough. He's made some impressive runs this weekend. I'm going to have to do the same thing I do against our competitors against him, and that's do everything right in the seat. Army then says that's what it's all about. Now to the kid, we call him, Ken Deppy. A lot of years experience. We know you're tickled to be back with the Dodge team. Can you get this guy? I'm not going to call him the old man while I'm standing right here next to him, but can you get him? And I think it's funny. Army says that, and you can almost see Fred kind of reach in just a little bit and kind of poke Army as he says it. It's hilarious. I love it. And then Ken says, I'm not going to call him the old man either. I don't know, Army. He turned the two fastest times ever ran on a monster truck this weekend. I've turned some fast times too, the fastest times I've ever ran, but I still haven't got quite as good as Fred. That just tells you how close these Dodges are. Fred's running fastest times in monster truck racing. Deppy's 0.2 of a second off of him and still slower.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's unreal to think of how closely matched these two trucks are, despite how different they are.
And we're at a point in the weekend where it really is just going to come down to almost whoever has the better luck. Everybody's so dialed in, and it's that little minute difference that's going to make the difference between a win and a loss. It's how you come off that first set of cars. And in this case for Fred, it's kind of at the starting line too. He pulls the wheels up on that tacky clay in Ohio.
Yeah, he pulls the wheels up and rides this thing down the track. Mark, you were actually here for this. What did that pass look like from the stands?
It looked like a faster yet tamer wheelie run, from Wildfoot. And I say tame because it wasn't quite the wheelie we all loved Andy Brass doing, but at the same time it was just fast. And you thought he was going to hold it almost the whole time. And it was just amazing seeing those trucks go that fast too. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit to a couple of years ago to even now. I was talking to somebody, a former Paul Schaefer Motorsports employee. I'm not going to name his name right now. But we were just going back and forth on how fast those trucks were then and how they would be outdated now. considering what the trucks are doing now in competition, if you want to call it competition. Yeah, I said that. But yeah, it was just amazing watching that stuff. And again, that's why I started following the Dodge guys.
I mean, they're making tremendous power, and you see Fred pull the front wheels up over this first set of cars. It's hard to tell with the camera angles because we're zooming out as the truck hits the first set. I'm not sure the front tires touch the first set of cars at all. I mean, it just sets him on a perfect lay down.
Perfect trajectory straight down the track.
Oh, perfect. I mean, he gets the power down in no man's land. He skies over the second ramp at full speed, and we've got another new world record.
Yeah, from 471 down to a 464. What I loved about this pass was the wheel stand that he pulled through no man's land and how perfectly the suspension settled. He literally lands the front tires on the second jump right before it goes into the air, and I think that's what actually pulls the truck forward over the cars, is that helpful hint from those big front tires spinning, and when they meet hooks grab that jump, that just pulls Fred even farther out there, pulls him straight. We started the weekend with a record of a 491 set by Andy Brass, and it's been lowered by almost 0.3 of a second between two trucks this entire weekend.
It shows the compete level, you know, between all these guys. And the way that they produced this show seemed to be a little bit different than some of the other episodes in this season. Because of some of the other segments they did, some of the stuff seems a little rushed, and I'm not sure if that's on purpose, but they literally cut from Fred's in the shutdown area slowing down. They have his time graphic up, and they cut to the Bigfoot trucks moving into the lanes already. You know, it's like they're keeping the program moving, and like they got to get to the line, they got to race. This is for all the marbles that we're going to the finals here, and who's going to go up against Fred.
Yeah, they only have about a 20-minute runtime here for this television show, so I'm sure that they're trying to throw as much information at you as they possibly can. So like these trucks, they're trying to set a world record time of getting everything they can in the episode. The interesting matchup we have, though, right here is Power Wheels Bigfoot against Bigfoot. And this might actually be one of the first times we saw number 14 and number 15 compete against one another here on television, at least. Like we said, after the RCA Dome show, which was the start of this, there was a 7-month gap between this event and that one. So I imagine they probably matched up a few times here and there between then. But this is the first time I think we're going to actually see this matchup on television. And I got to tell you, number 14 and number 15 right here, two of the most iconic Bigfoot trucks ever built. And like we were talking earlier, they're both pretty much identical.
Yeah, and throw a blanket over them anytime they go up against each other. You know, we get a whole shot here. There's not really a big difference on the light that I can tell. The difference for me is the way that the trucks come off that first set of cars again. We've talked about it on multiple episodes here on the Monster Truck Review. And especially these Penda races, the way you come off that first set, Meager just barely dips the right rear into the trunk of that last car, kind of trips the suspension up a little bit, and that makes all the difference.
Yeah, it's barely, like something I put in my notes, barely noticeable on tape. Just how much of a difference that makes for that truck, just how much it upsets the suspension. And the right lane does it again there for Dan Runte. He moves on to the finals with the same final that we had the day before between Power Wheels and Barefoot. And I got to tell you, right here, you're kind of seeing what tone the season's going to take.
Yeah, we're talking about the compete level this whole time. Fred ran the quickest ET ever in the last race. Runte comes back with a 486, I believe it is, 485. Not a bad run, but, you know, we're now, 2/10 off the pace, and we're still running what we think is a very good run, but they got to go back and say, hey, Fred got you by 2/10 going into the finals.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine that? Dan Runte gets, hey, Dan, you ran a 485. That's great. Red ran a 470 or a 464. What?
Yeah, I mean, we go into this finals, and it looks like Bigfoot's still on their heels.
Yeah, but before we get to the finals, we get one of the main reasons that Mark's here on this show. We see some Tough Trucks highlights. And I got to tell you, it's one of the funnier Tough Truck highlights that we actually see here, and that's with the Yeehaw truck that your dad actually ran for a number of years out there on the track. Actually, you can describe it better than me exactly what this truck was, Mark. So go ahead.
Well, it was a 1987 Jeep Wrangler, straight six in it. At that point, that was the second engine that was put in it because he had cracked the engine block twice. The first time in '92 at the RCA Dome, That clip is on YouTube, by the way. You can see him almost win the race. And yeah, he had I'm trying to remember what exactly he did just before that season. I know he didn't have a sponsorship, but he had the stickers for CKT, which is a Chicago Kart something. I don't know what the T stood for. They did some stuff with the front shocks, so that way it almost had like that really interesting off-road suspension. That roll cage technically should not have been used because all it was welded to the stock roll cage and then bolted to the frame. And usually they wanted you to weld that stuff to the frame, but they let it slide. And if I'm not mistaken, the tire on the back was actually, the way he mounted that to the back is he had his friend weld the old tire mount on there. But he was running 4 inches of suspension. I think he had 31 mud terrains or all terrains on it. And yeah, that thing's still sitting in his garage. It's been in there actually since that year. At the end of the year, his last show, he cracked the engine block again. And that's a whole different story I'll tell you guys about later. But when you watch this clip, here's a couple interesting facts about it. When he actually hits the ground, you'll notice that the tires kind of smush. And what ends up happening is the front shackles of the springs, the leaf springs, dig into the ground. And that's what sends him over.
Mm-hmm.
And he's maybe about a half a foot off the ground when he's going over. And we've got pictures from the magazine from behind the guy recording it. And then, of course, we've got the footage, several copies of the footage. I remember seeing that happen. My mom thought he was dead. Her hands are over her mouth the entire time. Me and my brother are screaming, "Dad's going to be on TV!" That's all we cared about. We were excited. A couple of our friends, Joe Brozovich's wife was sitting up there. He was the Stars and Stripes Bronco, for those who don't know. His wife was up there. I don't even think they were married at the time. If they were just married. I could be wrong. I could be very wrong on that. Joe can correct me if he's listening. But she's shaking my mom, trying to get her to snap out of it. My sister's clueless or sleeping. I don't know. But my dad rolls out. First person up to the Jeep was actually Bob Chandler. As I don't want to say they were good friends, but they were always really good to each other. They were always really friendly. And up till that point, there really weren't a lot of tough truck rollovers like that. There, actually, RCA Dome, now that I think about it, earlier that year, the one guy in the white Jeep flips over next to him, and that was one of the first real flips, too. So there wasn't too much that happened like that. George Carpenter's up by the truck trying to figure out how to flip it back over. And that was actually, this is where, like you asked if Army chimes in. This is one of the instances where we had no clue what was going on, what my dad was saying. We just knew Army was talking to him.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole thing.
You always know if Army Armstrong.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
If Army Armstrong was talking to you, you know, there's probably a good, strong chance you're going to end up on the television show. So that's probably why you guys were cheering. He's going to be on TV. What I love about this is the actual clip that they say. And Army says, "This is a street vehicle now, folks. He drove his family to the race in it." I have to ask, first off, is that true?
No, actually, it had been trailered for the past several years. So he did drive that to Indianapolis, the fairgrounds, a couple times, but it had he had started having, because he had been competing it more regularly, he had started having issues driving it to the jamborees. So he bought a trailer and we started hauling it around. He had bought a Cherokee, which my mom kind of took over. That became the family vehicle, and we hauled it around on that. And actually, right after that flip, I don't remember if it actually went to Joe Brozovich's house or the Hall brothers, but one of the two actually fixed the roll cage after that rollover. I do remember at the end of the year, we had to go pick it up from the Hall brothers shop, though.
We should talk about exactly how the truck rolled over, and that's the whoop section that they had out there. And honestly, when you look at the clip back, he's going pretty good through those whoops. And the suspension is soaking this up, and it's that last whoop section, like you said, when the truck hit the ground nose first, the leaf springs dig in and the truck just end overs extremely hard. And like you said, it's one of the harder rollovers that a guy has probably taken in a tough truck at this point.
Yeah, you haven't seen barrel rolls like that yet, and then there was only a handful after, and most of those were at pace shows or SRO, whatever you want to call them.
Mm-hmm. But what I really like about it though is the quote from Army. Like you said, this is a street vehicle, folks. He drove his family here in it. The rollover happens, and then you just hear Army kind of really softly. He's going home alone.
Now, Mark, I've got a question for you. You know, we're talking about the monster truck side of this throughout the podcast and how the competition is just increasing and increasing. You know, we're watching the tough truck highlights here, and there's just carnage everywhere. I mean, was it picking up for you guys on the tough truck side as well? I mean, I don't know if you guys were running for prize money or anything, but was it everybody kind of just wanting to get on TV that they were pushing it that hard?
Some people. I'm trying to remember some of the stories my dad would tell me about the jamborees, and then like Hank's jamboree that was out in like just outside of Chicago, and some of those podunk fairs that you would see. Those were guys who would just bring a truck to wreck it, hoping they'd get on TV. But there was very few of those, because if you notice when he rolls, there was a lot of the Penda guys, a lot of the special events guys went straight up to the truck and made sure he was okay and tried to figure out what was going on, what needs to be cleaned up, how they're going to flip it back over. That's actually part of the reason NMRO stood in and stepped up years later with the tough trucks, because those guys were starting to get serious. And you can actually notice in the background how many of those tough trucks were almost purpose-built off-road vehicles compared to like Hartman's Orange. He's taking up a beat-up old trail duster. I think Darmy's wrong. I swear that's a trail duster, but I could be wrong. And that dude just grenades it.
Well, it's so beat up you can't tell what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
At that point.
You can't really tell if it's a trail duster or a Ram Charger, but after that, it's going to the junkyard, which is a shame. Those are hard to find. But yeah, that was the transition point, in my opinion, when it came to tough trucks, because when he first got involved, it was 88, 89, if I'm not mistaken. It was going back and forth on the obstacle courses in Springfield. One of the last jamborees before they brought them back in the 2000s, that's Springfield, Illinois. It was my uncle and my dad going back and forth, and eventually they're just like, Dave, you won. We're not going to let you guys go out there because you're hogging up the spotlight. So my uncle was pissed, but if you ask him at a family party, my uncle will say he won. My dad will say he won, and then it starts a 20-minute argument.
Well, there you go. That's motorsports, folks, right there. I do love the interview, though. We got to touch on the interview afterwards. I love Army. He leans over. You guys are supposed to be doing this for fun. And your dad says, it was fun. It was fun until I saw the ground coming up, and I said, uh-oh. I'll let you finish the interview.
Yeah!
There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, you and I traveled. We went to a lot of shows together, so that's why I invited you on here. I thought it would be a really cool addition to the podcast. I really do thank you for that insight right there, especially for the tough truck portion of the show. Like I said, this stuff's evolving just as much as the monster trucks did back in the day at this point, as far as I'm concerned. It's cool to get that insight. Thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. And something I noticed when you sent me notes earlier is you mentioned when we were going to buy the top of the food chain truck, and we didn't. We unfortunately weren't able to get it.
Yeah.
And
me and my delusional young dreams.
Oh, yeah. I think if we would have met the reserve, we could have totally gotten it. But for the people that don't know, me and him had this, I don't know if he remembers it like I do, but I had the agreements where he got to run indoors and I would run it outdoors.
Yeah.
And we were going to split that. But what I don't know if you remembered, I knew the entire outdoor schedule for several promoters.
Yeah,
like
somehow I felt
indoors,
like I was
so
going to
knew
get
I was
screwed
gonna
on
be
that
running
event.
more.
Felt like I was going to get a little screwed on that, but anyway, it's all water under the bridge now. We go on to the final round of the monster truck competition. We've got Barefoot and Bigfoot Power Wheels, and Fred, to no one's surprise, takes the right lane here. Fred has been there so good all weekend, and by this point, he set a world record in every pass today. Literally every pass that Barefoot has made, he has set a world record in. You got to wonder what he's going to do here in the finals. And honestly, it almost takes your breath away when you get the result of this race. This is a very controversial ending, and the way Army treats it after the fact, when they do the interviews and everything, it's taken exactly the way that it should be, as far as I'm concerned, as far as what Army says here. To make a long story short, Bigfoot Power Wheels ends up taking the win, even though Barefoot's first across the finish line. But the rule that we have always seen and we have always heard in monster truck racing is the front two tires must hit the last jump coming across the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Fred does right here. The tires hit, but he jumps wide right. And when he does, he lands on top of a well-placed cone that you see over there just outside of the track. This cone is supposed to have represented an out-of-bounds barrier, and up to this point, nobody had seen this issue.
Oh yeah, that was one of the things I found funny, is it kind of goes back to the wheelie part. How many people with the 2-and-2 rule, as it was always called, did the wheelies? The front wheels needed to touch the cars of the last jump. So if you're popping a wheelie over the cars, those front wheels never touch. You technically should have been disqualified. But that's being really petty, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. That's being a little bit petty. But I think that what happens right here, Matt, and you can chime in on this too. Barefoot jumping wide right and landing on this cone. I think he's first to the finish line. As far as I'm concerned, he wins the race.
Yeah, I mean, Fred definitely gets to the line first. In any other event that I can recall up to this point, it would have been, I think, a legal run. You know, the Penda rules that they had covered at the time were always, the only out of bounds they ever mentioned was if you crossed the center line and made contact, you're disqualified. But if you cross the center line and didn't make contact, you're fine. You know, we see a similar situation in Bloomsburg where Runty, you know, almost T-bones Carolina Crusher, and thank God Gary gets on the brakes and avoids the contact. He could have, you know, slid into Runty a little bit and taken the win because Dan's in his lane, but you know, things work out the way they do. And George Carpenter, we go to a video of him in the trailer, and he disqualifies Fred on the basis of jumping over the out of bounds cone. He says he's over the cone.
Yeah, he says he's over the cone. But
look at how many drivers are actually in that standing outside of that too, including
that was something else I was going to point out
for Barefoot at the time too.
Yeah, Perkowski's there. Pam Waters is there. We've got Brian Welsh there. We've got another.
It looks in the background.
Looks like a crew guy standing behind those folks. I mean, let's
put it this way: there's a sellout at that monitor right there with a lot of guys just standing there, and honestly, they're probably trying to figure out this just as much as everybody else is.
Well, here's the thing when it comes to Fred. Fred was always a very fierce, very technical competitor. And he was known to rub those guys the right way and the wrong way sometimes. And I've seen this a lot firsthand, and I've heard plenty of stories. If he thought he won, that's why when you get to the interview, he's like, I didn't hear about that rule. I didn't know. Because he doesn't want you to know that there was that rule. Because he wants that win. And he did that a lot. And they were intense. Him and Kathy were always very intense when it came to competing. Because if there was a technicality, like someone red lighted or someone went out of bounds, they would be on top of it and they'd be hooting and hollering. They were almost as, sorry, Everett Jasmer, but they were just as bad as him.
Yeah, but honestly, I kind of agree with him right here. I mean, jumping out of bounds. Okay, then if you're jumping out of bounds, then what is the purpose of the 2-and-2 rule? Hitting the front tires on the cars. Fred is out of shape, guaranteed. Yes, he is out of shape. Yes, he does jump wide right. However, he gets both front tires on the jump, and at that point, he's in the air. He can't control the truck at that point. So as far as I'm concerned, once his front tires cross that finish line barrier, there is no issue.
I agree with that 100%. Because if it's past the finish line, if it was before the finish line, yeah, if he lands over it or passes it and then lands out of bounds.
Well, okay. Honestly, even before the finish line at this point, like I said, he's made the legal run. He's gotten the front tires on the jump legally. At that point, he's in the air. He can't control where this truck is going at this point. And as far as I'm concerned, the only line that really should mean anything as far as safety is the center line. He's jumping wide right. There's really nothing there that he's going to potentially hurt or hit anything or run into anything, the angle that he's going. So I don't see the necessary penalty right there. I really don't.
And you can look at this from another angle as well. You know, I'm looking at this frame by frame coming across. Fred's in the air as he breaks the finish beam. You know, the truck technically if it were to be on the ground, you know, would be out of bounds, but he's still in the air.
Yeah.
So is the run over at that point? You know, and that's been a question of mine in a couple different calls in monster truck history, you know, where, you know, something happens after the fact that somebody gets disqualified for that maybe wasn't a hard rule or something that had been done prior. My take has always kind of been, you know, if you're legal at the finish line, you're done. The run's over at that point, you know, or if somebody red lights, the race is over. And it doesn't matter if the other guy DQs also, because the run's already over and that guy should move on, you know. But Army always says rules are rules. You live and die by the rules. But sometimes it's the way those rules are being interpreted and who's interpreting them. Let's not forget, on a previous episode of the Monster Truck Review for Retro here in Columbus, Jack Willman wasn't too happy with George Carpenter either for a little bit.
No,
So
he wasn't happy with him at all because of the four-wheel drive rule.
George had to play the bad guy in a lot of instances, and not saying that he played favorites or anything. I'm sure he tried to call it right down the middle as he saw it each time. But it's hard to be that guy, you know, when you have to make those judgment calls. And, you know, maybe somebody from the Bigfoot camp got a hold of George in his ear and said, hey, he landed out of bounds. He should be disqualified. Maybe that's what caused them to look at the video. So, you know, there may have been more at play here than what we think.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you just said, too, because George was a longtime friend of Bigfoot even before it became what it was. Because George actually owned the two yellow trucks that were used in Take This Job and Shove It, which a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting there's any conspiracy here or anything that.
No.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that either.
What I'm saying is that Bob
all the time because he knew Bigfoot.
Yeah,
and that was always something that, you know, the industry guys knew. It's just like, hey, you're playing favorites with Bob. It's there's been instances where I've heard that as well. And he's like, no, that's not the case. He's like, I'm trying to be fair. It's just like the TNT guys, the USHRA guys, and the Jamboree guys. They're always just like, we need to play it as fair as possible. I'm not playing favorites, even though, you know, you knew the guy behind the scenes for most of the career.
And we're talking about Fred being a severe and fierce competitor. Bob was too. So I'm sure that he had somebody on that, you know, videotape looking at it and saying, you know, we need to go either file a protest or make sure that the right call is made here. And to his credit, if that's what the rule was, they have every right to do it.
Yeah, you got to remember Bob had his own equipment too, so he was probably already rewinding it after the call.
Yeah, very true. Like Bigfoot videoed every single one of these races, and they would take that videotape back and they would study their suspension, study the event, and study what they could do differently on those trucks in mid-90s, and they probably still do some of that to this day, I would assume. But like I said, I don't agree with the call here, and you're talking about Ed Carpenter being friends with Bigfoot. I understand that. This call right here could be one of the reasons why you hear a lot of people saying that to Ed, maybe down the road, is, oh, you're favoring Bigfoot. I could kind of see the argument there with this, but like Matt said, if this was listed in the rule and Fred jumped out of bounds, as bad as this looks and as controversial as it is, it's in the rule book.
Yeah, and let's flip over to Runty's. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Oh, no, sorry, man. I was going to tell you something interesting because it when it comes to after this race, if you look at a lot of the other footage from the other jamborees following this, the out of bounds at the end of the track is more defined. Usually it was just one or two cones at the end of the track to help with the center lane. But afterwards, because I'm actually watching it as I'm talking to you other videos, I see there's more cones. They started putting poles and other markers at the one of them. A good example is Bloomsburg. And Canfield's a later one too, or possibly an earlier one. I forget how the seasons worked out. But you'll see it. There's more definition at the end of the track, so they can avoid those. And it was definitely because how how nitpicky Fred could be, and I really hate saying it like that because he's one of my favorite drivers, and I've been trying to get a hold of him for a couple of years. I got some really cool vintage photos that I need to send him.
Well, one thing I do want to ask means that you were there. The show ends with a closing interview between both Fred Schaefer and Dan Runte. But after this race is over with and you see Barefoot cross the finish line first, what's the crowd thinking right here? Are the people leaving? Do they think, oh, Barefoot won? Or are they sticking around for the announcement?
It was a mix of both. Because a lot of people definitely thought Barefoot beat him. But you could tell that people wanted to know who actually won because the announcer was just like, oh, there's a little bit of this or a little bit of that. And you like I said, you couldn't really tell over the engines what the announcer was saying, but people stuck around and wanted to make sure. And, of course, it's in an uproar when Bigfoot's announced as the winner. But I always thought it was interesting. And this goes because I know we're going to talk about how the point standings say, hey, Barefoot's in the lead right now. I was always shocked that Barefoot actually never took away a Penda championship. That always amazed me, considering how this weekend in particular went for them. It was an amazing weekend that they were, kicking butt, breaking records, and starting trouble with the final run. And they're in the lead for one part of the season. By the end of the season, they lose, and 2-3 years later, he's out completely, and he still never won.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for Fred right there. Army pops in here. We see the interview. So we got a controversy finish. The Fords are going to take home the win. He'll get the points coming out of here. The Dodge was the first to cross the finish line, but disqualified because he jumped out of bounds. Army turns to Fred and he says, now the way I understand the ruling in the past is you have to get both front tires to hit the last jump at the end. I never knew there was an out of bounds at the finish line. And Fred, you can hear the frustration in Fred's voice. He says, Army, I'm not sure about the out of bounds finish line either. They said they brought it up in the meeting, but I wasn't aware of it. So did Fred just mishear that? Or is Fred literally what Mark was saying right here, kind of passing off the judgment a little bit onto Ed Carpenter?
It was probably, I don't want to say it was too much George's fault, but that's one of those things that...
George Carpenter, not Ed Carpenter. Sorry, I called him an IndyCar driver's name. My bad.
Wait, who's Ed Carpenter? I forget who that is. Maybe it's John Carpenter making pretty good scary movies.
Hey, there you go. There you go.
Now, you can definitely tell when Fred said something like that, it was a rule that was either overlooked for a long time, and he finally got busted for it, or they are just like, hey, we're going to call it like this, and that's that, and, crap or get off the pot. Love it or leave it. And you can tell he definitely is like, I got to leave it alone because...
Yeah, he's leaving it at this point. He doesn't have any more chiming in at all after this. Mm-hmm. And it kind of surprises me to hear that he doesn't say too much more after this. He kind of he's there at that point. He doesn't even want to be talked to after this little clip that he has. And then we cut over to Dan, and Army literally says, okay, very good. And then he goes over to Dan. Dan says, not to take anything away from you in the Ford camp. The guys have been rocking and rolling all day long. You guys have been earning your keep on this thing. You're going to be back in the points chase. Were you aware of the fact that the truck was out of shape on the last jump and that you had to pedal it to keep it straight? Now, at the time when I first heard this, I thought, I thought Dan was a little bit confused because I thought that Army was talking about Fred's run. He's actually talking about Dan's run. And Dan does reply back with, no, Army, I really didn't backpedal. The truck kind of pulled that way off the jump. Because when you look back at this, and I had to do the same thing after the run was over with, I was focused on Barefoot. I wasn't focused on Bigfoot in the other lane. Bigfoot almost DQs the last jump.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Runte had to pull the truck back in for that second set of cars. And if you even look at the second set of cars, that first car is pretty wide, and it may have given Dan some benefit. I know they had some issues in Naples a couple years ago or before this where one car was wider than the other, so they started putting stakes in the ramps also. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure he had to have been inbounds there. But he had to work to keep that truck on a legal run as well.
Yeah, and my point is here at that point, who wins the race if they both DQ? Honestly, I would say they'd probably have to pull him back to the line and have him race again at that point. But anyway, just to kind of put a bow on all of this, I love the way Army concludes the interview, and it's an analogy not many people are going to get. He says, well, Ford did take the win here, but there may be a Dodge in the future, like a Dodge City. This shootout isn't over. He's referring, of course, to Wild West back in the day in Dodge City, Wyatt Earp, all that stuff. If you don't know anything about that, read it. It's a good read. Or just watch Tombstone.
Yeah, that was my suggestion, too. Just watch Tombstone. It's a crash course.
Yeah, there you go. Crash course on everything right there, especially how to walk through the middle of a pile of water screaming no and killing 5 or 6 people at the same time. But anyway, we go on to the points of the Penda Series. Barefoot still in the lead, 3,400 points to Gary Porter and Carolina Crushers, 2,560. Power Wheels jumps up to third place, 2,290. Rampage down to 2,000. And then Bigfoot jumps up into the top 5 with 1,640. And guys, I got to say, as far as these two broadcasts went, I really enjoyed, and I thought that they did a very good job with both of these broadcasts and presenting the product out there as a very serious motorsport in this broadcast. I thought they did an excellent job. I gave it a 9 out of 10 broadcast-wise. The racing itself, it doesn't really get good until the semifinals, but boy, when they kick in and they have these events, have these drivers put the pressure on, the races are fantastic, just like that final round we just saw.
For sure. I'm going to give it a solid 8.5 myself. And I think that's the highest rating I've given on the podcast so far. So, the production is good. The action is good. There's stories happening. The only thing that it could possibly be missing is maybe a little bit more, I don't want to say flair and excitement in a damage perspective, but a lot of these runs are real smooth and straight down the track. So not a whole lot of trucks getting out of shape. That's the only thing that kind of really falls maybe a little bit flat for me, but the racing's so good that I think it outweighs that. Good, solid program.
Well, we kind of got the excitement and everything like that out of Mark's dad.
Yeah. The damage is on the tough truck side for sure. And Mark, what do you rate this event?
Oh, I'm still kind of new to this, but I'll have to agree with you, Matt. It's about like an 8 or so. I'm trying to compare it to TNT and then what we see now, and it sounds like about 8.5, because this is what we would rush home on the weekends to if we didn't go to the events to watch. This was my Sunday morning cartoons, in lack of a better term. I didn't watch the cartoons. I watched Truck and Tractor Power and all the, the Power Block.
So what I'm hearing right now is that you didn't want to watch DuckTales. You wanted to watch Fred Schaefer.
Oh, no, I wanted to watch Fred Schaefer and Bigfoot and all those. Because actually there's a good story in that. When this episode aired, we were going to a family party. We're going to one of my dad's cousins. And we had watched it earlier that day because we stayed at our house in Chicago and watched it that day. And then we went to the party shortly after. But we get there and everybody's clapping and going, yeehaw! And being goofy. And they're like, we saw you on TV! But then again, these were a bunch of Italians, so I don't know why they sounded redneck.
Well, they had probably just got done watching some high-quality redneck programming.
Yeah.
So the voice rubbed off on them. But anyway.
Yeah.
Guys, I got to tell you. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I can reflect what Mark was saying. That's my Saturday morning, too. There was no DuckTales. It was Truck Tales.
Truck Tales?
There we go.
Darkwing Truck?
That's it.
There we go.
So
all right.
Definitely. Mark, thank you
name
for
a truck that, so you might want to get on that soon.
We got to get the trademark. Jump on that one, Josh.
All right, I'm going to jump on that one. That's actually, you know what? That's a great idea for a custom RC truck. Nobody steal Darkwing Truck. All right? I call it. That is mine. Anyway, though, guys, thank you both very much for being here. Matt and Mark, you guys did a phenomenal job. I'm really going to enjoy listening back to this episode, as I'm sure you guys will as well. I hope everybody enjoyed the return of this podcast as well. I know, like I said, been a couple weeks here I took off due to some personal issues and some family things that have been going on. I do want to say before we hop out of here, one more time, good rest in peace up there to my grandmother, who we lost. And I really thank you guys for help keeping my mind off of some things here that's been going on as well. Thank you guys very much for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, we will see you again on the tracks across America.